1 month after my daughter's wedding, the photographer urgently called me. "Ma'am, I discovered something terrible. Come right now and don't say a word to your daughter." When I saw it, it changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The wedding was everything Sarah had ever dreamed of. I remember standing at the back of the reception hall that evening, holding a glass of champagne I barely touched, watching my daughter dance with her new husband. The lights were warm and golden, the music was soft, and Sarah was laughing, really laughing, the way she used to as a little girl when her father would spin her around the kitchen. I told myself I was crying because I was happy. Mostly that was true. My name is Margaret Holland. People who've known me long enough call me Peggy. I'm 65 years old. I live alone in the house where I raised Sarah in Millfield, Ohio, and I spent 31 years working as a bookkeeper for a regional insurance firm before I retired. My husband, Tom, passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just Sarah and me. She was the whole point of everything. So when she brought Brandon Cole home 2 years before the wedding, I genuinely tried, to be open-minded. He was handsome in that effortless way that makes you slightly uneasy, the kind of man who always seemed to know exactly what to say. He worked in commercial real estate, talked confidently about investments and market cycles, and had a warm, practiced smile that he deployed like a tool. Sarah adored him. I told myself that was enough. His mother, Linda Cole, was another matter. I met her at the engagement dinner. A slim, well-dressed woman from Columbus who ordered the most expensive wine on the menu and spent the evening talking almost exclusively about her son's accomplishments. She shook my hand firmly, looked me up and down in a way she probably thought was subtle, and said, "Millfield. How quaint," I smiled. I filed it away. The wedding was in September. Small church, 100 guests, a reception at the Millfield Event Center. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. I paid for most of it, not because anyone asked me to, but because Tom had left us comfortable, and Sarah was my daughter. The one thing we'd splurged on was the photographer, a young man named Daniel Warren, who came highly recommended. He was professional, quiet, thorough. He shot 12 hours of footage and over 400 photographs. For a month after the wedding, everything seemed fine. Sarah and Brandon moved into the house on Elm Creek Road. Tom's and my old house, which I'd signed over to Sarah as a wedding gift because it was too large for me alone, and I'd already moved into a smaller place on Birchwood. I visited on weekends. I brought casseroles. I watched Brandon accept them with that smooth smile and barely look at me afterward. Then small things began to bother me. I noticed that Brandon had no photographs from before he met Sarah. None on his phone that he ever showed her. None on social media before 2021. No old friends who attended the wedding except 2 men I'd never seen before or since. When I mentioned it casually to Sarah, she said he was private. When I asked about his previous relationships, she said he'd told her there was one serious girlfriend in his late 20s. Nothing more. Linda, whenever she visited, had a habit of steering conversations away from the past, any past. If I asked something direct, she'd redirect with a compliment or a question of her own. It was skillful. Too skillful. I told myself I was a suspicious old woman who'd watched too many true crime documentaries. Then, 4 weeks after the wedding, my phone rang on a Tuesday morning while I was doing my grocery list at the kitchen table. It was Daniel Warren, the photographer. His voice was strange, tighter than I remembered, controlled, the way people sound when they're working hard not to sound panicked. "Mrs. Holland," he said, "I'm so sorry to call like this. I know it's been a month, but I've been going through the wedding footage for the final edit, and I've found something. Something I don't know how to explain." A pause. "I need you to come to my studio. In person. And please don't mention this to Sarah." "Not yet. I sat very still at my kitchen table. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. The grocery list was still in front of me. Milk, bread, apples. When? I asked. Today, he said, if you can. I could. Daniel Warren's studio was on the second floor of a converted building on Grant Street, above a dry cleaner's. I'd been there once before, to drop off the deposit check. The staircase smelled like solvent and old wood. He met me at the door before I knocked. He'd been watching for my car. Inside, the studio was dim except for the large monitor on his editing desk, which was already lit up with a paused image. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept properly in several days. He was a careful young man. I'd noticed that at the wedding, the methodical way he moved, never rushing. And that carefulness was visible now as he pulled up a chair for me and sat down across from me, before saying anything at all. I want to show you something before I explain, he said, because I think it'll make more sense that way. He turned to the monitor and pulled up a photograph. It was from the reception. A candid shot taken near the bar, showing Brandon in profile, talking to one of those two men I hadn't recognized. Brandon was half turned away from the camera, but the other man was visible clearly, and he was holding his phone up slightly, showing Brandon something on the screen. Brandon's expression was the thing, not his usual smooth confidence, something tighter, urgent. That alone may be nothing, Daniel said, but look at this. He opened a video clip, footage from the cocktail hour, a wide shot of the room that he'd been reviewing for background ambiance. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Linda Cole. She was speaking to the same man from the photograph, close and low, and her hand was on his forearm in a way that wasn't social. It was the way you hold on to something you don't want to get away from. I ran his face through a search, Daniel said quietly. I know that sounds like overstepping. I'm sorry, but something was bothering me, and He paused. His name is Gary Simmons. He's a notary public in Franklin County, and I found his name in a public court record from 2019. He slid a printed page across the desk to me. It was a marriage certificate. State of Ohio. Dated April 14th, 2019. Brandon Michael Cole, and a woman named Renata Voss. I looked at the paper for a long time. The dry cleaner's machinery hummed faintly through the floor beneath my feet. Is there a divorce record? I asked. My voice came out level. I was grateful for that. I couldn't find one, Daniel said. I searched Ohio records, Indiana, Kentucky. Nothing. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Sometimes they take time to index. But Mrs. Holland, I looked for 3 days. I couldn't find it. I sat back in the chair. Here is what I understood in that moment, with the clarity that sometimes comes when the thing you feared most finally has a shape. If Brandon Cole had married Sarah, while still legally married to Renata Voss, then Sarah's marriage was not a marriage. It was a fraud. And the house, Tom's house, the house on Elm Creek Road, which I had signed over to Sarah as a gift, and which was now legally in Sarah's married name. That house was sitting inside a union that had no legal standing. I was a bookkeeper for 31 years. I understood exactly how documents worked. I understood what could happen to property inside a fraudulent marriage when that fraud was eventually unraveled by someone other than us, someone who didn't have Sarah's interests at heart. Does anyone else know you found this? I asked. No, Daniel said. I called you the minute I decided I had to call someone. I thanked him. I asked him to print everything he had and to store copies somewhere safe. His email, a cloud drive, somewhere outside his studio. I asked him not to contact Sarah and not to contact anyone connected to Brandon or Linda. He agreed. He looked relieved to have handed part of this weight to someone else. I drove home slowly. I did not cry in the car. I saved that for later, standing at Tom's photograph on my bookshelf, pressing my hand flat against the glass because I had to press against something. Then I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where the phone had rung that morning, and I made a list. Not groceries. The kind of list I used to make at work when a file had gone wrong and needed untangling. What I knew, what I didn't know, what I needed to find out, and who I could trust. What I knew: Brandon had a prior marriage on record. No divorce filing found. Linda knew Gary Simmons and had spoken with him at the wedding, meaning she almost certainly knew. What I needed: a family law attorney, a second search of divorce records by someone with professional access, and time, a little time, before Sarah noticed I was pulling at threads. My first call the next morning was to Eleanor Marsh, who had handled Tom's estate. She wasn't a family lawyer, but she would know who was. That was where it started. Eleanor Marsh had been Tom's attorney for 15 years, and mine by extension. She was 71, still practicing, sharp as a paper cut. When I called and said I needed a referral for a family law matter, sensitive, urgent, not something I wanted discussed over the phone, she didn't ask questions. She gave me a name: Patricia Gould, family law, Columbus. 20 years of practice, half of it in cases involving fraud, asset protection, and contested marriages. Eleanor called ahead. I drove to Columbus on a Thursday morning, told Sarah I had a dental appointment, and sat in Patricia Gould's office on the 9th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition. Patricia was in her early 50s, compact and precise. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. Then she looked at Daniel's printouts for a long time. "What you have here," she said carefully, "is suggestive, not yet conclusive. A marriage record without a corresponding divorce record is not proof of bigamy. It's a gap. Gaps can be filled or they can be real. We need to know which. How do we find out? I have a paralegal who does exactly this kind of record search. Professional access, multi-state. If there's a divorce filing anywhere in Ohio or adjacent states, she'll find it within a week. If she doesn't find it..." Patricia folded her hands. "Then you have a much more serious situation, and you'll need to decide how you want to proceed before anyone else does." I authorized the search. I wrote a check. I drove home. The following days were some of the hardest of my life, not because of what was happening, but because of what wasn't. Because on the surface, nothing had changed. I called Sarah on Sunday evening like always. I heard Brandon's voice in the background. I watched my words the way you watch your step on ice. But something had shifted over there too. I sensed it. On Wednesday, Sarah called me. Not our usual evening call, but midday, slightly too casual. She mentioned that Linda had stopped by unexpectedly and had been asking whether I'd seemed off lately, whether I'd mentioned anything worrying. Sarah laughed it off, said Linda was always dramatic, but I heard the edge beneath the laughter. Linda was checking. I didn't know what had tipped her. Perhaps Daniel Warren had been less discreet than I'd asked, looked up something in a way that left a trace. Perhaps Linda simply had good instincts, the kind that come from having managed secrets for a long time. Either way, she was watching now. I said nothing to Sarah. I said I'd been tired, maybe a little quiet, that was all. On Friday, Patricia Gould's paralegal delivered her findings. Patricia called me herself. "No divorce filing," she said. "Anywhere." We searched Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, where Renata Voss's last known address was registered. Nothing. Brandon Cole and Renata Voss are, as far as any official record shows, still legally married. I sat down. "There's more," Patricia said. "My paralegal found Renata Voss. She's living in Sarasota, Florida now. She's not hiding. She still carries the name Voss Cole on 2 of her accounts. And there's something else. A small claims proceeding in Franklin County from 2020, a landlord dispute. The defendant is listed as Brandon M. Cole, and the address given is the same Columbus apartment where Renata Voss was registered at the time. They had been living together as recently as 2020, 1 year after the marriage, 3 years before Brandon met Sarah. Patricia, I said, is this bigamy? If these records are accurate and no divorce was ever finalized, she said, then yes. Brandon Cole committed bigamy under Ohio law. Sarah's marriage is void, and depending on what can be proven about intent, particularly around the property transfer, you may also be looking at civil fraud. The house, Tom's house. What do? I asked. You let me file a formal records request with the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics, she said. Official confirmation, that becomes a document. Once we have it, you'll have to decide. Do you go to Sarah first, or do you go to law enforcement first? Either way, we need to move carefully and quickly, because if the other side realizes what you have. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I told her to file the request. Then I hung up and stood at my kitchen window and looked at the yard where Sarah used to play, and I thought about Tom, and I thought about what he would have done. He was a quieter man than me, steadier. He would have said, Peggy, you already know what's right. You're just scared. He was correct. I was scared. But I was also past the point of turning back. The official confirmation arrived on a Tuesday. A letter from the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics forwarded through Patricia Gould's office, confirming that no dissolution of marriage between Brandon Michael Cole and Renata Voss had been recorded in the state of Ohio as of the date of inquiry. Patricia had already contacted Florida and received a parallel confirmation. The document was real. The marriage was real. And Sarah's marriage. The wedding, the vows, the certificate on the wall of her kitchen was legally meaningless. I decided to tell Sarah before anyone else could get to her. I called and asked if I could come for lunch on Saturday. Just the two of us, I said. I'd bring sandwiches. Sarah sounded pleased. She mentioned that Brandon would be at a client meeting in the morning, that he'd probably be back by early afternoon, and I said that was fine. I'd aim for noon. I didn't tell her to make sure he wasn't there. I didn't want to alarm her, but I timed it carefully. She met me at the door in her weekend clothes, hair loose, looking happy, the specific happiness of someone who doesn't yet know their house is on fire. I hugged her for longer than usual. She noticed. Mom, you okay? We sat at the kitchen table. I set out the sandwiches. I let her pour the iced tea. And then, because there was no way to soften what I was about to say that wouldn't just be delay, I told her. All of it. Daniel's call, Patricia Gould, the records, Renata Voss. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry immediately. She went absolutely still, the way she used to as a small child when she was working hard to understand something. That same expression, 2/3 concentration and 1/3 dread. Then she looked at the table. Mom, she said quietly, are you certain? I have the documents in my bag, I said. Patricia Gould has official copies. Sarah pressed both palms flat on the table. Her eyes filled. She said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Then she asked very quietly, Did Linda know? We don't have direct evidence of that yet, I said honestly. But the man she was speaking to at the wedding is a notary who witnessed documents in the same county where Brandon's marriage to Renata took place. And she was at the reception, Sarah. She was right there. Whatever Sarah said next was interrupted by the sound of a key in the front door. Brandon came in 40 minutes earlier than expected. He took in the table, the papers Patricia had prepared that I'd laid out, the look on Sarah's face. And his expression shifted in a way I'd never seen before. The smooth surface cracked, just for a second. Then it reassembled into something colder. Behind him, Linda Cole walked in. She hadn't been mentioned. She hadn't been invited. She came in like she had every right. Peggy, she said, looking at the papers on the table without looking at my face. I was hoping we could all sit down and talk about this calmly. You knew, I said, not a question. I think, Linda said carefully, that there are things you don't fully understand about this situation, and that if you take legal action, which I understand you've been exploring, you will cause enormous damage to your daughter that cannot be undone. I'm asking you, as a mother, to let us handle this privately. I looked at her. I thought about Tom. I thought about the house on Elm Creek Road. I thought about the 31 years I'd spent making sure numbers were honest. What you're describing, I said, is asking me to help cover up a felony. Brandon leaned forward. His voice dropped to something quiet and specific. He said that if I pursued this, he would make sure certain information about Tom's estate became public. Some accounting question, he said. Something that had always seemed irregular to him. He said it looking directly at me. He said the word irregular. There was nothing irregular about Tom's estate. I knew that down to the cent. But I understood what he was doing. He was telling me he would manufacture something, or try to, and that the process of defending against it would be expensive and exhausting. That's called extortion, I said. My attorney will be very interested to hear it. He stared at me. We're leaving now, I said to both of them. And if either of you contacts Sarah directly before she's spoken with my attorney, that will be noted and documented. There was a long silence. Then Linda touched Brandon's arm, and they left. Sarah and I sat there for a while afterward without speaking. She was somewhere I couldn't reach yet, working through the particular grief of realizing a person was never who they said they were. I just stayed beside her. I drove home that evening, exhausted in every cell. I spent the next 3 days doing almost nothing. I walked. I slept. I ate soup. I let myself be the age I actually was, just for a little while. Then on day 4, I got up, made coffee, and called Patricia Gould. The call came on a Thursday evening, just as I was washing my dinner dishes. It was Brandon, not Linda, which surprised me. His voice was different from that Saturday afternoon, softer. He said he'd had time to think, that he knew he'd handled things badly, that he was under enormous pressure and had reacted in a way that wasn't fair. He said he wanted to make things right. He used that phrase several times. Make things right. Then he said that he and Linda had discussed it, and that they were prepared to be generous. He used that word carefully, too. He said Sarah would want for nothing, that they would cover whatever legal fees had been incurred, that a settlement could be arranged, that the house could be formally retransferred to Sarah's name in a way that protected her regardless of the marriage question. He said all I had to do was walk back from the legal process. Let it be handled quietly. Let lawyers sort it out privately without involving courts or authorities. I let him talk. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the neighbor's porch light come on in the dusk, and I let Brandon Cole speak for 4.5 minutes without interrupting. Then I said, Brandon, what you're offering me is the same thing Linda offered me on Saturday, dressed up in cleaner language. You committed bigamy. That's a crime under Ohio law. You cannot compensate your way out of a crime by writing a check to the victim's mother. A pause. Sarah is the one you've wronged, I said. And Sarah is speaking with her own attorney now, not just mine. Whatever you have to offer it to her through counsel. Don't call me again. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, aware of a very specific feeling that I can only describe as clarity, not triumph. I'd learned enough by then to be wary of triumph before something was truly finished. But a kind of cold, quiet settledness, like a level reading 0. They were watching, I knew, probing for the soft place. Brandon with his reasonable voice, Linda behind him calculating angles. People who operate through manipulation are very good at finding what people want and offering a version of it. What they had misunderstood was that I didn't want anything from them. I wanted what was correct. Sarah had retained her own attorney by then, a young woman named Christine Ibarra, who specialized in family law and had been recommended by Patricia Gould. Sarah was devastated, but she was also angry. And anger, in my experience, is more useful than devastation when there's work to be done. She moved through the initial consultations with Christine the same focused way she'd moved through school, head down, step by step. I worried about her. Of course I worried, but I also knew my daughter. What I needed now was steadiness on my own side. Not just legal steadiness, Patricia had that well in hand, but the human kind. The kind that comes from people who know you and will tell you the truth. I called my friend Dorothea Sims, who had been my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together, and I told her everything. We sat in her living room for 3 hours. She listened, asked practical questions, and at the end said simply, "Peggy, you're doing the right thing. I don't want to hear that you're doubting it." I wasn't doubting it, but it helped to hear. I also called my nephew James, who worked in commercial property law in Cincinnati. I wasn't asking him to represent anyone. That wasn't his area, and it would have complicated things. But I wanted a second pair of experienced eyes on the property question. James read the relevant documents and confirmed what Patricia had already told me. The transfer of the house to Sarah existed in a legal gray area that needed to be resolved through the court process, not around it. Any private arrangement Brandon and Linda proposed would, at best, be fragile, and at worst, another layer of fraud. "Aunt Peggy," he said before we hung up, "whoever told you that you could be bought off with a quiet settlement badly underestimated you." I thanked him and said I was inclined to agree. Dorothea, James, Patricia, Christine, Sarah herself, who was still speaking to me every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just to hear a familiar voice. That was my circle. It was enough. Brandon and Linda were quiet for 10 days. I didn't mistake that for retreat. People like that don't retreat. They regroup. I spent those 10 days keeping my schedule. Morning walks, grocery runs, calls with Patricia, being boring, ordinary, unhurried. Because when they came back, and I knew they would come back, I intended to be exactly where I was, standing still, level at 0. They came on a Sunday afternoon, 12 days after Brandon's phone call. I saw the car in my driveway from the living room window, Linda's silver Lexus, which I recognized from the wedding weekend. I watched them sit in the car for a moment before getting out, which told me they'd rehearsed this. The sitting was the last review before the performance. I opened the door before they knocked. Linda was dressed carefully, not overdressed, deliberately not, beige slacks and a plain cardigan, the costume of someone who has come in peace. She was carrying a small bakery box tied with a ribbon. Behind her, Brandon looked exactly as he always had, that easy, handsome calm that I now read the way you read a brand on an animal, understanding it as a mark of ownership rather than a feature. "Peggy," Linda said, "we came to apologize, properly. We should have done this sooner." I stepped back and let them in. Not because I trusted them, I didn't trust them at all, but because I wanted to hear what they'd prepared. And I wanted it to happen in my house, on my ground, where I knew where everything was. We sat in the living room. I didn't offer tea or coffee. Linda set the bakery box on my coffee table like a small peace flag. She began with Brandon. She said he had made a terrible mistake, that the situation with Renata was something he had believed was legally resolved, that a private agreement had been reached, that paperwork had been filed, that apparently hadn't processed correctly. She said this with a kind of mournful reasonableness that I imagined had worked on many people in many rooms. "He didn't deceive Sarah intentionally," Linda said. He believed himself to be free. The fault, if there is fault, is in the process, not in his character. I looked at her. I thought about the notary, about the name Gary Simmons, about Linda's hand on that man's forearm at the reception, about the phone records Patricia had been quietly requesting through proper channels. "Linda," I said, "Gary Simmons witnessed Brandon's 2019 marriage certificate. He was at my daughter's wedding, speaking with you, 6 years later. Help me understand how that fits into a story about paperwork not processing correctly." Something moved behind Linda's eyes. She recovered almost instantly, but I saw it. That fractional recalibration of someone who realizes a room they thought they knew the layout of has a wall where they expected a door. "I know Gary socially," she said, "that's all." "Of course," I said pleasantly. Then Brandon spoke. And here is where the mask slipped most clearly. Because Brandon was a man who believed ultimately that everything was negotiable, and negotiation was the thing he actually did well. He leaned forward and he said, reasonably, quietly, with the face of someone helping, that he wanted me to consider what a court process was going to cost. In time, in money, in what it would do to Sarah publicly. He said he'd spoken to someone familiar with how these cases proceeded in Ohio, and that the property question alone could take 18 months to resolve, during which Sarah could not sell the house or use it as collateral. He said all of this was avoidable. "We can have documents drawn up this week," he said. "Sarah keeps the house, free and clear, a settlement to cover what she's lost. And this ends privately. No one needs to know what happened." I sat very still. I understood what he was offering. Not peace, control. The narrative that he and Linda could live with, and that Sarah would spend the rest of her life holding like a sealed box she was never allowed to open all the way. A private ending is only ever private for the person it protects. "I hear what you're saying," I said. "And I want to say something clearly so there's no misunderstanding. Patricia Gould has already filed a formal complaint with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. That process is not mine to stop. Sarah's attorney has filed parallel civil actions. Those are not mine to stop either. This isn't a negotiation I have the power to end, even if I wanted to, which I don't." Linda's composure finally, visibly cracked. Not loudly. She was too controlled for that. But her jaw tightened and her hands pressed flat on her thighs, and she looked at me with a coldness that had nothing performed in it. That was the real Linda. I'd waited a long time to see her. "You're going to regret this," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but I'll regret it honestly." They left. I closed the door behind them and stood in my hallway for a long moment. And yes, I was afraid. A real, physical fear. The kind that sits in your chest like a held breath. These were people who had already demonstrated they would lie and construct and threaten. But the fear didn't unmake anything. If anything, it confirmed it. You are only afraid of people who have something real to defend. And what they were defending told me everything about what they had done. I went to my kitchen and wrote down every word of that conversation, time-stamped, signed by my own hand. I emailed it to Patricia that evening. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office moved more quickly than I had expected. The complaint Patricia filed had been bolstered by the time it landed on a desk by a considerable dossier. The official vital records confirmations from Ohio and Florida. Daniel Warren's photographs and video showing Linda Cole with Gary Simmons at the wedding. Patricia's documentation of Brandon's attempt to induce me to withdraw from the legal process. The written record of their visit to my home. And one additional piece of evidence that Patricia's office had quietly secured through proper legal process. Phone records showing 17 calls between Linda Cole's number and Gary Simmons's number in the 6 weeks before the wedding. They had not been careless. They had been careful, and careful people leave a careful paper trail. Renata Voss, contacted through the Florida address on record, had agreed to cooperate. She had not known about Sarah. She had, in fact, believed for years that Brandon was simply estranged. She had heard from him last in 2020, she told investigators, and had assumed the marriage was effectively over. When she learned he had married someone else in 2023, she was, by the investigators' account, quietly furious in the specific way of someone who had suspected something for a long time without having a word for it. She had driven to her own attorney the same afternoon she was contacted. That decision made her a cooperative witness rather than a reluctant one, and it mattered considerably to the shape of the proceedings. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in February. It was not a criminal trial. That process moved on a separate track. But it was the first formal proceeding in which all parties would be present, and it concerned Sarah's petition to have the marriage declared void and to establish clear title to the Elm Creek Road property. I drove to Columbus the night before and stayed at a hotel 3 blocks from the courthouse. I wanted to be rested. I ordered room service, which I never did, and I sat at the small desk by the window looking out at the city lights and thinking about Tom, and about the kitchen table, and about all the ordinary mornings between then and this one. I wore the gray wool suit I'd worn to Tom's funeral because I believe in showing up to serious things seriously dressed. Patricia met me in the hallway outside the courtroom 20 minutes before the hearing. She was brief and calm. The documentary record was solid. Renata Voss had submitted a sworn statement, and Gary Simmons, who had retained his own attorney as soon as the complaint was filed, had cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. He had notarized documents he knew were part of a fraud. He had confirmed Linda Cole's knowledge and her direct involvement in planning the deception. All of it was in the record. Brandon and Linda arrived with their attorney, an expensive one from a Columbus firm I recognized the name of, and sat across the room. Linda was impeccably dressed. She looked at me once, briefly, and then away. Brandon did not look at me at all. He looked at the table in front of him and at his hands, and once at the door, in the way of someone doing a quiet calculation about exits. Sarah sat beside Christine Ibarra. She was pale and composed, the way she'd looked at her father's hospital bed. Present, without reserve, because there was no point saving anything for later. I noticed she had worn her grandmother's pearl earrings, the same ones she'd worn at the wedding. I don't know if that was deliberate. Knowing Sarah, it probably was. I sat behind her, 1 row back. The hearing proceeded. The judge, a woman in her early 60s, reading glasses pushed up to her forehead when she wasn't using them, worked through the documents with methodical patience. She had clearly read the file thoroughly before entering the room, which the quality of her questions confirmed. Brandon's attorney offered several arguments, each one a variation on the theme of procedural incompleteness, administrative delay, good faith belief. The judge listened to each one with complete attention and then asked for the specific filing that would substantiate a good faith divorce filing. The attorney asked for a continuance to locate it. The judge asked how long he had been on the case. He said 6 weeks. She said that was sufficient time to locate a document if one existed, and she would not be granting a continuance. I watched Brandon from my seat. He was, for the first time in my experience of him, visibly unsteady. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who would permit himself anything obvious in public. But his composure was working too hard. He kept touching his collar. His eyes moved to Linda's face and away again in a rhythm that suggested he needed reassurance she wasn't in a position to give. She was managing her own face with too much concentration to spare any for his. Linda was very still. The stillness of someone who has deployed all their resources and is now waiting to see if they were enough. They were not enough. The judge read her findings in a clear, measured voice, without drama or flourish, which somehow made it more final rather than less. The marriage between Sarah Jean Holland and Brandon Michael Cole was declared void ab initio, void from the beginning, as though it had never legally existed. The property transfer to Sarah was confirmed as unaffected by the void marriage, as it had been a gift transaction from parent to child, properly documented in Sarah's individual name prior to the ceremony. The civil fraud claim would proceed to a separate damages hearing. Criminal proceedings were already underway in parallel. The room was very quiet after she finished. I looked at Sarah's shoulders from behind. I watched her breathe. One slow breath, then another. The pearl earrings caught the light. Brandon's attorney was already leaning toward him, speaking quietly. Linda sat without moving for a long moment, longer than was natural, and then turned and looked at me. Not the calibrated coldness from my living room, but something rawer and less managed. Something that had given up performing. That was the real Linda, and I had waited a long time to see her without the performance in the way. I held her gaze until she looked away. I'm not a cruel person. I didn't feel satisfaction, exactly. I felt the particular exhaustion of a long and necessary thing reaching its proper end. Patricia leaned over and murmured, "That went as well as it possibly could have." "Yes," I said. I reached forward and put my hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder. She put her hand over mine without turning around. That was enough. The criminal process moved at the pace criminal processes move, which is slower than anyone would like and faster than the guilty ever hope. Brandon Michael Cole was charged with bigamy under Ohio Revised Code 2919.01 in March, a fourth-degree felony. Gary Simmons was charged with tampering with records, a third-degree felony, given the deliberate nature of the fraud. Both men entered plea negotiations that spring. Gary moved quickly. He had a family, a business license to protect, and apparently a realistic sense of how the evidence would present at trial. He cooperated fully, confirmed the timeline of Linda's involvement in detail, and accepted a plea that included a fine, probation, and the surrender of his notary commission. Brandon took longer. His attorney attempted several angles that the prosecutor's office declined one by one. He ultimately pled guilty to a reduced filing of attempted deception, still a matter of public record, still searchable, still the kind of entry that changes how a professional history reads to anyone who looks carefully. 2 years of supervised probation, a fine of $8,000. He stood in a courtroom in Columbus on a Thursday afternoon in April and said the word guilty in front of a judge and a court reporter and whatever composure he had left. I was not in that courtroom. I had said everything I needed to say in other rooms and through other documents. I didn't need to watch. Linda Cole was not charged criminally. There was sufficient evidence to establish her knowledge, but insufficient for prosecutors to demonstrate she had directly participated in the filing fraud beyond a reasonable doubt required for criminal conviction. That was a disappointment. I had been honest with myself about the possibility, and I sat with it for a few days without trying to argue myself out of the disappointment before I let it go. The civil record told the story regardless. Public records have a permanence that doesn't require anyone's cooperation to maintain. The civil damages hearing took place in late April. Christine Abera presented Sarah's case for financial damages resulting from the fraudulent marriage, emotional harm, legal costs, the period during which Sarah's property had been encumbered and effectively unmarketable, and the documented financial losses Sarah had incurred in anticipation of a legal marriage that had no standing. The judge awarded Sarah $62,000 in damages to be paid by Brandon. Whether he would pay it in full or on what timeline was a question Christine would continue to monitor. But the judgment was on the record. It would follow him to any future financial proceeding, any loan application, any property transaction, any professional context where a civil judgment check was run. That was the durable consequence, and it was the right kind. The house on Elm Creek Road was Sarah's, free and clear. The title company confirmed it within a week of the civil ruling, issuing a clean title in Sarah's individual name without encumbrance. I went over on a Saturday morning, and we sat on the back porch together drinking coffee, and the late April sun was exactly right, and Chester the dog was asleep across Sarah's feet. And Sarah said, "I keep expecting to feel relieved, and instead I just feel tired." I told her that was exactly right. That was what real things felt like after they finished, unlike stories, which delivered a clean emotional release at the moment of resolution. Real things left you tired and intact. The tiredness was evidence that it had been real, and the intactness was the victory, even if it didn't feel like one from inside it. She nodded slowly. She understood. Brandon moved back to Columbus. In Millfield, the social process had been quiet but thorough. Word circulated the way it does in a small town, through the particular channels of people who know people who were at the wedding, who read court notices in the local paper, who asked questions and received answers. By the time his plea was entered, Brandon Cole was a name attached to a story in Millfield, and that story had no version in which he was the wronged party. The social world he had entered by marrying Sarah closed behind him like water. His employer in commercial real estate, a mid-sized Columbus firm, had parted ways with him before the plea was formally entered. They had conducted their own due diligence when the charges became public, and the result was a separation described in his paperwork as mutual, which was the professional word for something that was not mutual at all. He eventually found work at a smaller property management company. The position was less prominent, the salary considerably reduced, and the professional ceiling apparent to anyone who understood how reputational damage compounds across time. Renata's divorce was finalized that summer in Florida. She had been his legal wife for 6 years. She received nothing from him beyond the legal dissolution, no assets, no settlement, because there was nothing coherent to divide. What she received was her name back and clarity about what the years had contained. That is not nothing. Linda returned to Columbus and to a life that was perceptibly quieter. I heard, through James, and through the particular way that information moves between people who have been involved in a proceeding together, that several of her Columbus friendships had not survived the publicity. The specific social architecture she had built, the one in which she was a capable, discerning woman whose son was a success, had been substantially revised. She was not in poverty. She was not in legal jeopardy. But she was operating in a reduced world, which for someone like Linda, who had built her identity around expansion and management, was its own particular consequence. Daniel Warren, the photographer, was the reason any of this had happened. I sent him a formal letter, and I also called him. I told him that what he had done, that decision to pick up the phone, to act on what he'd found rather than tell himself it wasn't his business, had changed my daughter's life. That his instinct to do the right thing had been worth more than he probably knew at the time he acted on it. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said he was glad. He sounded young and sincere, and I believed him completely. I referred 3 wedding bookings his way that year through friends and clients. It seemed small. It was the best I could do. Eleanor Marsh called me in May to ask how things had resolved. I told her the summary. She was quiet for a moment. "Tom would have been very proud of you," she said. I put the phone down for a full minute after that. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at his photograph on the bookshelf, and I let myself feel it properly. When I picked the phone back up, I said, "He would have said I took too long to get started." Eleanor laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her. "That sounds about right." Autumn came to Millfield in the way it always did. Slowly and then all at once. The maples along Birchwood turning from green to amber almost overnight. The smell of wood smoke from somebody's fireplace finding its way through my kitchen window on weekend mornings. The light changed. The air sharpened. The town settled into the particular rhythm of a place that has existed long enough to know what it is. I settled into my life with a gratitude I'd forgotten was available to me. After Tom died, I had become careful. Not depressed. I want to be precise about that, because there is a difference, and the difference matters. Careful in the way of someone who has lost the other half of an arrangement they relied on completely, who does things correctly and safely and without much spontaneity, because spontaneity had been Tom's department, and without him it felt irresponsible. I had kept the grocery list. I had kept the schedule. I had kept the careful shape of a life without fully inhabiting it. What happened with Sarah and Brandon had, oddly, broken that open. There's nothing like being genuinely tested to remind you that you have capacities you'd stopped calling upon. I had made decisions under pressure. I had sat in rooms with people who frightened me and not shown it. I had followed a thread I couldn't see the end of and trusted myself to handle what I found. And I had. That was available to me again now as a fact I knew about myself. That fall, I started a small bookkeeping consultancy, part-time, entirely by referral, working with small businesses in the county that needed quarterly help and couldn't afford a full accountant. I charged a reasonable rate, worked from my kitchen table 3 mornings a week, and found that I had genuinely missed the particular satisfaction of making numbers tell the truth. There is a quietness to correct accounting that I have always found steadying. The way a balanced ledger simply is what it is, without ambiguity or performance. Dorothea referred the first 2 clients. Eleanor Marsh referred a third. Within 6 months, I had a quiet, manageable practice that earned me enough to take a trip to Portland in the spring to visit a cousin I hadn't seen in 4 years. We walked along the waterfront for 2 days and talked about our lives properly, which we hadn't done since our 30s. I joined the book club Dorothea had been trying to recruit me into for 3 years. We read things I wouldn't have chosen myself and argued about them with a cheerful ferocity that I found unexpectedly restorative. I planted tomatoes and basil in a small raised bed in my backyard. The tomatoes were modest but real. The basil was extravagant. I was, to summarize, living. Actually living, not maintaining. Sarah, by the following spring, had begun to emerge from the long interior work of recovery in a way that was visible and specific. She accepted a promotion at the architectural firm where she worked. Project lead on a regional civic building, the kind of work she had been aiming toward for years. More responsibility, more visibility, considerably better pay. She refinanced the Elm Creek Roadhouse in her own name alone. Strong credit, stable income, no complications of any kind. And I watched her sign the final documents over video call with the expression of someone setting down a book they'd read against their will, permanently, on a high shelf. She met Marcus the following autumn, a quiet, precise engineer who had moved to Millfield for a position with a regional infrastructure firm and knew almost nobody in town. He moved through rooms like he was thinking about load-bearing walls, which I mean as a compliment. He was steady and genuinely funny in a way that took a while to notice, and he was careful with Sarah in a way that looked like consideration rather than caution. I liked him immediately. I waited 8 months before I told Sarah. She said she'd known since the first dinner, when he fixed my back door handle without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. Chester, the golden retriever, extended him a provisional tolerance that gradually became something indistinguishable from devotion. As for Brandon and Linda, I thought about them less than I expected. Brandon was employed below his previous level, legally encumbered, operating in a narrower world. The civil judgment sat on his record. Linda had returned to Columbus to a quieter life in which several friendships had created distance, and the projects she'd spent years managing were in public ruins. I imagined she'd found a way to frame it as someone else's fault. I did not imagine it brought her peace. On a Saturday in late October, Sarah and Marcus came for dinner. I made Tom's chicken and dumplings. Sarah brought apple wine. Marcus arrived with farm stand flowers, slightly unruly, last of the season. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where the call had come in, where I'd made the list, where I'd had my coffee the morning I decided to stop being afraid. The leaves were down. The porch light was on. Chester was asleep with his chin on Marcus's shoe. Sarah was talking about the civic building project, the way light would move through the entrance in winter. And she was animated and present and fully herself. I sat at my table and listened to my daughter's voice. That was everything. That was entirely enough. I didn't set out to be brave. I set out to be accurate. There is a difference between those two things, and I think it matters. A photographer made a phone call he didn't have to make. A paralegal searched records no one had asked her to search before. I wrote a list at a kitchen table instead of closing my eyes and hoping. None of that was heroic. All of it was necessary. If you had been sitting where I was sitting, if it had been your daughter, your house, your family, what would you have done? I think I know. That's why you stayed until the end. Thank you for listening.